This is Speaking of Writers. I'm Steve Richards. This is Speaking of Writers. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Honor Lost. The author is Jason Kyle, a lifelong geek and history buff. Jason Kyle also loves tabletop gaming, fantasy fiction, and action movies. He also has spent over 20 years in the U.S. Army, which includes 3 tours to Iraq between 2003 and 2011. These interests and experiences inspired Jason to try his hand at writing. He currently lives in Georgia with his young son and their cat Shadow. Jason Kyle, welcome to this program.
Thank you, sir.
So, Honor Lost. What is this book and story all about?
In a nutshell, it's a story about a group of mercenaries living in a conquered realm, very much inspired by events in history like the Irish, the English's occupation of the Irish, and incidents like that throughout history. So it's a conquered people for a few generations, and now these mercenaries living in this realm, they're working for the empire that conquered them, and they get to a point, there's an event in the story where they decide that the status quo needs to be reevaluated, to say the least.
This empire, the Untveski Empire,
yeah.
This character of Owen, how did you create Owen?
He's kind of a Merlin character a little bit. I wanted a young, he was about, I was in my mid-20s when I first wrote the story while I was in Iraq. So I wanted the story to be told, not necessarily in my mind, the most heroic character would actually be in the story. Usually if I see a story similar to what I've written, usually the main character would actually probably be somebody like Captain Shieldheart, the leader of the mercenaries. I don't like stories that focus on the main character. I think it's more interesting to tell stories from a secondary perspective. So don't tell a story about King Arthur, tell the story from Merlin's perspective, which of course in that particular mythos it's been done as well. So my character Owen is kind of a young Merlin, if Merlin was actually part of a mercenary band in a Camelot that had already been conquered by the bad guys.
Yeah. You said you wrote this in Iraq. What was that like? Was it a nice distraction for you?
Yeah, well, so in that particular deployment, we would go out in the mornings and afternoons, do a mission, then come back, and some guys would play video games, some guys would go to the gym. I would go up to my room, and since my internet connection wasn't very good, I couldn't play games of my own, so I would write.
Did you use an outline for this book?
Oh yeah. I had several pages of like the good old like bubble diagram where I like, okay, here's the central idea, and then just start drawing ideas and brainstorming. I had a bubble diagram for the basic outline of the story, and a whole separate diagram for the backgrounds of all the characters, not the mythology, but the pantheon that I created for this realm, and a little bit of fleshing out world history and stuff like that, world building and whatnot. So yeah, I definitely had an outline.
Jason, did the story come to you first, or a character?
Story, definitely. It came from just one idea. I was watching Return of the King, and a thought hit me like, I wonder what this world would be like if Dark Lord Sauron had won. Well, it would be and really quickly, the answer to that is one of two things. Either the world just crumbles into nothing in the void, I guess, or the world goes on, but now you have a very skewed, so the bad guys are in charge, so now you have a very skewed worldview. And so I guess it'd be about like what I would imagine living in North Korea or someplace, I guess, would be like.
We're chatting with Jason Kyle here on Speaking of Writers. His book is Honor Lost. It is available at writersrepublic.com, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, and also in some select bookstores soon too, as well.
Yeah, soon.
This story is the first of a planned trilogy, maybe more. We were just talking earlier about that. The second one is done, right?
Yes.
And the third one you're working on?
Third one, I'm kind of waiting to see how this one goes.
Yeah.
I have other things going on. I'm still a couple years away from retiring from the Army and some of that. So I've been wanting to publish this one for a while. I finally decided, this is a good time as any to spend the money, do the work, and get it published. if it does reasonably well, even just well enough to give me a little bit of hope, I'll put out book 2, which, as we were talking earlier, book 1 and book 2 were in reality originally part of the same very large story. And then I split it in 2 once I realized, oh, this is actually a lot bigger than most normal novels. And conveniently enough, part 1 and part 2 are both actually the size of a normal novel. So I'll tidy up some loose ends in part 1 and make it a standalone story. Now, the result is that it doesn't quite have as much of it. It's not quite as epic. It's a little bit more internal. A lot of the drama that happens is a little bit more internalized inside the characters' heads, because it has more of a prequel feel to it. Whereas the real main event that I'm leading up to, the big turning point would happen in book 2. Because it's a story that takes, it's the evolution of characters who go from kind of indifferent professional soldiers, working for an empire that they've known the whole time are dirtbags, and it goes through my stories go through the process of how do they go from that point to the kind of people who will stand up to that empire, even knowing that, hey, you know what, we might die in the process, but our honor demands that we stand up to this empire regardless of the risk involved.
I'm chatting with Jason Kyle here on Speaking of Writers. Honor Lost is his new book. Were you always a good writer? And how did you get interested in writing?
So I mean, even as a kid, I thought I was going to end up in comic writing. I draw a lot, yeah. And I would tell stories, usually iterations of what I was reading as a kid: Batman, Spider-Man, etc. And then as I got older, the idea of turning my art into a job with deadlines and so that, and other people telling me what I had to draw, kind of detracted from it. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, man, art is what I do for fun. I don't want to have people dictate what I have to draw and have deadlines. So I joined the military instead, but I've always enjoyed telling stories. I've always gotten good grades in essays and whatnot. And my teachers and then later college professors always tell me, oh yeah, you have a really distinct voice. I'm not always sure if that's a compliment or not, because they tell me I have a very flippant tone and so that, very snarky. That's the word one of my professors used. I have a very snarky tone. So I'm like, well, at least it's distinct. And I always got good grades. So I'm like, okay, well, I'll give a try at writing. And then I did, and I showed it to some of my buddies. And I mean, guys tend to be pretty brutally honest with each other anyway.
Yeah.
Soldiers more so. We delight in putting each other down. So when I showed my story to other soldiers who happen to also like fantasy fiction, and they like it. They liked my writing too. I'm like, okay, maybe I'm onto something here. So I finished up the story, and now I'm seeing what I can make of that. And 2 of the characters are, I think I actually put in the forward of my book, 2 of the characters in that story are very much directly ripoffs of a couple of guys that I was serving with at the time. And I told them I was putting them in my book too. So.
Most literature and film that covers soldiers always uses really common stereotype personalities. What makes your books different?
Well, because I have 20 years of experience of actually serving with soldiers, of being a soldier. So yeah, usually especially in fantasy fiction, when soldiers are depicted, they're usually background characters, and you always see the same. Oh, this one's the Joker. Oh, this one's the big dumb guy. Perfect example. Look at Star Wars Bad Batch that me and my son like watching together. It's not a bad show, but it's the embodiment of all the military stereotypes that that Hollywood doesn't know how to do nuanced characters. So at least definitely in terms of military characters, you can tell that they just have no idea what to do with them. So I thought, okay, instead of making a character like right now, I've been watching on Amazon, I've been watching Vox Machina, a really, really awesome show based on Critical Role. And even there, but even those guys, they go with the standard, oh, this one's the warrior, the bards, for that. They're all civilian, if you want to class, they're civilians. If they have soldiers in it, they may be, every now and then you'll see a genre where somebody has a military background, but they're not military now. And if they do have a military background, they're always the gruff, stern, no nonsense guy with no sense of humor.
Yep.
That's totally the opposite of soldiers. Soldiers are we have we have to have active sense of humor, the kind of stuff that we have to deal with on a regular basis. Humor is how you survive the insanity. So, like, if in my story, the guys we're constantly in my book, they're constantly joking each other. They're I think a little bit more real. I would challenge somebody to say, okay, go ahead. Aside from maybe the leader, show me which stereotype that they fit into, and I don't think they really do.
How much of you, Jason, is in Owen?
In Owen, his nerdiness. I think it's either man. In my mind, I have a hard time separating events from book 1 and 2 because they spent so long as part of the same book. But there's scenes where my character is walking through where Owen is like walking through a forest or something like that, and he's reading up on his scrolls, because that's kind of I do take some stereotypes from D&D and whatnot. I tried to turn those stereotypes on their head when possible to kind of change my fantasy up a little bit so it's not completely generic. But one thing that you do see a lot in the fantasy trope is that wizards have to study their spells in order to be able to cast them later. So I have scenes where he's walking through the forest just completely heedless of his surroundings, making noise, and he's reading and stuff like that. And the other characters who are being all stealthy are like, "Oh, dude, come on, man. Situational awareness." So that's another thing. My story has Hollywood loves making references, clever little Easter eggs to other movies or literary figures. My book is a nod. There's so many nods to the military community, where, like, especially for a soldier or Marine, there's going to be a lot of little in jokes in there that a soldier or Marine will absolutely get. Hopefully civilians can enjoy it as well. But even like just some of the place names and stuff like that, there'll be soldiers. If a soldier or Marine reads it, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I know what he's talking about there." I make jokes, like even just little things like Lord of the Rings, I think, did it, where Aragorn at one point they're camping for the night, and Aragorn's like, "I'll take the first watch," as if that. And I've seen that in movies where the noble character is volunteering to take the first watch, and every time I see that, me and anybody who's ever gone on a field exercise, we're like, who cares if you take the guy who's trying to get out of work is the guy who volunteers for the first watch, because you're already awake. But if you're really trying to impress somebody, volunteer for the middle watch, where you have to wake up from a sound sleep in the coldest part of the night, stand watch for an hour, 2 hours, and then try to go back to sleep for just a couple more hours before you're woken up again. The middle shift, that's, if you're trying to be heroic, that's the shift that you volunteer for, not the first watch. So I make a joke out of that, where I have a character, I think Durgan, where I have him go, "I'll take the first watch," and everybody goes, "Dude, shut up."
Jason, what would you like readers to take away from Honor Lost?
It's largely inspired by like good old. I grew up reading a lot of before I got into fantasy fiction. I was reading a lot of Louis L'Amour westerns, and his stories are just good old adventure stories. There's nothing deep thinking about them. There's nothing allegorical about them. There's just good heroic characters, the kind of guy that you like. I have a 10-year-old son, and Louis L'Amour he writes the kind of characters that I could point to my son and go, "Look, the characters like this is what you want to emulate." And I'm not a very poetic guy. I'm a pretty direct guy. So Louis L'Amour's writing style very much appealed to me, and that's why I kind of tried to write for my own story. I wanted to write characters set in a really bad environment, who go from acting like normal people who are just trying to keep their heads down and get by in life, to the kind of people that I've admired. Like, look at that Chinese guy, years ago, who stood up in front of that column of tanks in China or Taiwan. And who stood up all by himself, like the kind of courage that takes. Or the defenders of the Alamo, who volunteered to stay, fight, and at some point they had to know they were going to die, but they did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. And I wanted to tell a story about a group of people in a fantasy genre, because that's the genre I just enjoy most, I want him to be military because that's what I know most, and that's where I never see I never see military characters in the foreground of almost any novels, really, unless it's specifically a war novel. You know, they're always civilians, and like I said earlier, if there are military people present, they're background characters. So I wanted to set it up with a group of soldiers, professional soldiers, and it's essentially what mercenaries are. And that's another reason why I chose mercenaries, is because it seems like mercenaries always get a bad rap, like they're bad guys. Like, they're just professional soldiers paid to fight. That's not inherently moral or immoral. So I just want, it's intended to be a good adventure story about a group of soldiers who have to evolve with the times that they're living in, and have some fun and have some adventures along the way. And you get to see the kind of the evolution of them going from that very self-centered view to the end point where they're going, okay, you know what, even if this is a lost cause, I'd rather die for what I believe. Where they get that conviction, I'd rather die for what I believe than live another moment in the shadow of this empire.
And it's the first of three, maybe more. Honor Lost by Jason Kyle. The book is available at writersrepublic.com, also amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, and in some select bookstores soon, too. Jason, thank you for your service, and thank you for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was fun.
And this is Speaking of Writers. This is Speaking of Writers. I'm Steve Richards.